Eileen McMurr. I'm the Executive Director of the League of Women Voters of Texas, and it's always fun to see all your faces. I talked to some of you on the phone. I have emails with you, so it's great to see you all. I have a couple of tasks, and one is to welcome you on behalf of the board and the Service to Local Leagues Committee. I want to thank the Service to Local Leagues Committee, Meg, Scott Johnson, Janice Richardson, Susan Majors, Linda Vaughn, and off board we have Ruth Ann Gear. I think I saw Ruth Ann, and Pat Chung, who was just speaking a moment ago. And I wanted to say, you know, the League of Women Voters, as you all know, is a nonpartisan organization. We do not support or oppose any political parties or candidates for public office. It's one, let's see. For those of you who may be interested, we do have captioning, closed captioning, and you can click it on. It says like live on Zoom with rev.com on my screen. So you can check that out if that's helpful to you. And I also want to talk about, we are working in partnership with Texas Impact, which is an organization, it's a coalition of faith-based communities across the state. And they're hosting a rally, and our national president is coming down. They're having an evening program before the rally on the Sunday, the 18th. And our national president is going to give a presentation on a panel that night. And Virginia Case, who is a wonderful speaker. And then the next morning, there's going to be education around the voting bill, the bills that are being the ones, you know, the new ones that we're looking at, and how to talk to your legislators about them. And then the rally is from 11 to 12. And afterwards, we're inviting people to come and visit with their legislators from their district. The Texas Impact, they have a registration, and Texas Impact is, their website is texasimpact.org. And I think that's all my tasks. Janice, I'm gonna hand it over to Janice.
Well, hi, everyone. I'm Janice Richardson, and I chair the Service to Local Leagues Committee for our state league. Tonight's workshop is the second in our summer workshop series. As Meg was just mentioning, our tradition is to have in-person workshops across the state every other summer. But obviously, because of the pandemic, we're using Zoom as a way to connect for learning this summer. And I know it's not the same, but there are indeed benefits, aren't there? And we can see that by just how many people registered for tonight. And then we'll be able to watch this workshop because it'll be recorded and they can see it later if they can't make it. So you may remember that we kicked off in June, our summer workshop series in June, with the workshop on the Welcoming League that featured the incredible work and wisdom of Texas leagues. And tonight we're going to zoom out, no pun intended, to take a big picture look at the topic of growing interest and concern that is important for our mission of empowering voters and defending democracy, and still in the vein of the Welcoming League. Tonight we're focusing on civic learning and civil discourse, and we're featuring learning from two highly respected national organizations that work on these topics and share both our interest in democracy and our nonpartisan stance. We're going to wrap up our series in August by returning to the league world to talk about being league in this political climate. So as our workshop team is beginning to think about this series, I had the pleasure of meeting Nita Thompson, a longtime member of the Richardson League here in Texas. I chatted with her, and as Nita and I talked, the idea for this workshop began to take shape. So I thought it might be fun to kick off tonight with a quick chat with Nita. So I saw her here on board earlier, and Sophie, if you could help Nita and I join the screen together, that would be fantastic. So welcome, Nita, and thank you for helping us get started tonight. I understand that you're particularly interested in civic learning and civil discourse, our topics for tonight, and that you have been encouraging your league in Richardson to work on these questions, and just wonder if we could chat a bit about what sparked your interest and why you see this as a good fit for your local league.
Yes, civil conversations are very important to me. And after the San Bernardino shooting, a group of Muslims and Christian women began meeting in homes monthly for lunch with the purpose of building understanding. We had delicious food, we had stimulating conversations, and we had loads of laughter. We actually have become really good friends in the last 6 years. But recently, this multi-generational group faced a challenge that stretched our relationships in ways that I would have never imagined. And it was the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. The Muslim women started posting videos and urging us on our WeChat group to join them in various activities, such as signing petitions and supporting resolutions that were blocking sales of weapons to Israel and other things. And some of the Christians were more sympathetic than others about this, but none of us were really ready to take actions in the ways that our friends suggested, which really surprised them because we had been at the airport, at DFW airport, and whenever all the immigrants were banned from coming in, as you will remember not too long ago. But anyway, feelings about our lack of response were very strong enough that they decided to cancel our upcoming gathering. So instead, 2 of the Muslim women and 2 of us met to discuss this dilemma. And our goal really was to build understanding and to listen to one another. And usually I love to have those kind of discussions, but this was a hard discussion with people who I really, truly admire. And I had learned a lot from this discussion. Some of the takeaways for me were that Muslims and Christians view geographical place in different ways. For example, Muslims consider the Al-Aqsa Mosque to be the 3rd holiest place in the world. So when the Jewish police entered that mosque, they were deeply offended. Christians, I don't think, view even our most beautiful cathedrals as, we see them as architectural treasures, but we don't think of them as holy places. When I think about the church, I think about it as the people. So we really looked at place in different ways, and we learned that from having this discussion. I am very concerned about what is happening in Afghanistan in regards to the women that are going to continue to be suffering and suffering more and more. I consider that as very, more important probably than the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. But for the Muslim women, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, this war, was of far greater importance. So we shared lots of perceptions. We realized that we utilize very different sources for gathering our information, and we have varying levels of trust in the media. We learned many, many things from the time this 2 hours that we spent together. But it was a respectful conversation. It was a civil conversation. I'm glad we had this conversation. I learned a whole lot. But to be honest, when it was over, my blood pressure level was much higher than it was whenever I went into that conversation. And I didn't even sleep good that night. So it is hard to have civil, meaningful conversations.
So Nita, what is your hope for your league to be more comfortable with this?
When Janice and I were talking, she mentioned to me that libraries are still safe places for people to have good conversations. And it is my hope that our league could be a safe place for people who have different perspectives to come together and to build trust and build understanding and learn to respect one another and have civil discussions.
Thanks, Nita. Thank you so much. It was so fun talking with you and meeting you.
Thank you.
So now we're ready to hear from our presenters. We'll have time for questions after the presentations. And so if you have a question that comes to mind, you can type your question into the chat box. And when we get to our Q&A time, Aline will be watching for them and getting them to our presenters. So without ado, it's my pleasure to introduce our first presenter, Melinda Gilmore, who's Director of Strategic Initiatives at the Kettering Foundation. And she'll tell you more about the Kettering Foundation, but just a couple of words. It's a nonprofit operating foundation rooted in the American tradition of cooperative research. Primary research question is, what does it take to make democracy work as it should? Melinda's research interest includes the role of civic organizations in addressing the problems of democracy, particularly humanities-based organizations such as libraries, nonprofits, and philanthropy. So you can see why she's such a good fit with our league world. So thank you. So Melinda, just turn this over to you, and we're ready to go.
Great, thank you. Well, I'm gonna try to screen share. So give me just a second, and I'm gonna bring up a presentation that'll help us be together this evening. And I'm gonna play it from the start, and hopefully this works. And it looks like it is. Are you all seeing a slide that says, what does it take to make democracy work as it should?
Yes.
All right. Yay. Okay, good. That means it's working. I should admit that at Kettering, I'm so used to doing face-to-face convenings that PowerPoint is not one of my primary skill sets. So anyhow, good morning or good evening, goodness. I'm thrilled to be with you and so happy to share a bit about Kettering's research with the Texas League of Women Voters. As Janice just mentioned, I'm the Director of Strategic Initiatives at the Kettering Foundation. And in that role, I'm lucky to have the opportunity to do a variety of things, including participate in our research program, track what we are learning over time, and look for new research opportunities, as well as communicate what we are learning. The Kettering Foundation is a nonpartisan, nonprofit research organization. So just like the League of Women Voters, we take a nonpartisan approach to all that we do. Our research focuses on what people can do in their communities and in collaboration with institutions to address the problems that they face. And our primary research question is, what does it take to make democracy work as it should? Our main campus is in Dayton, Ohio, and we also have a small office in Washington, D.C., in the Hall of States building near the U.S. Capitol. The foundation was created in 1927 by Charles F. Kettering, who's best known as the inventor of the self-starter for automobiles. So every time you start your car with a key, rather than cranking the engine, you have Kettering to thank. This spirit of invention has stayed with us over the years. Although interested in practical solutions, the inventors who first staffed the Kettering Foundation looked for the problems behind the problems or the sources of the difficulties they were trying to overcome. Then they observed experiments to find answers, and we have drawn on that research legacy in our study of democracy. Today, the foundation looks for experiments that might counter the problems behind the problems keeping our democracy from working properly. These aren't just problems in or within a democratic country, they are the malfunctions of democracy itself. At Kettering, we watch 3 areas for experiments that promise to deal with these malfunctions. In one area, we look at how people take on the responsibilities of citizenship, such as making sound decisions together to guide the work they must do together. And to understand this decision-making, we have observed, among other groups, those using the National Issues Forum's issue guides. which are based on the Foundation's research on deliberative decision-making. Betty will talk more about those later this evening. Another area of Kettering research has to do with how citizens and communities come together to combat the problems that affect everyone. This includes how people decide what should be done about their problems. And we try to understand how this work is done so that people can make the difference they want to make. Now, the third area of research focuses on the major institutions involved in various ways in governing our country. So that includes governments, civic organizations, philanthropies, schools and colleges, religious congregations, the media, businesses, scientific institutes, and others. We try to understand how these institutions relate to a democratic citizenry, and we hope to learn whether citizens are effective in engaging these institutions. The only country we study is the United States, but our research is enriched by what organizations in other countries share with us. Because not all of the institutions concerned with democracy think of it the way we do, we make it clear that our type of democracy requires self-responsibility. So in this slide, I've shared the 3 questions that really orient the research in these areas of work. These questions include, how do people become engaged as citizens and deliberate to make sound decisions? What practices help citizens work together to solve problems and educate their children, beginning in their communities? And also, how can a productive citizenry work with governmental and non-governmental institutions as those institutions try to work with citizens? Research in these 3 areas is overlapping and interconnected because the elements are necessarily interdependent. Citizens do their work in the communities in which they live, and so what citizens do has consequences for communities and institutions. And what institutions do has consequences for communities and citizens. So the chart in this slide is one of the ways we try to illustrate how the work is overlapping and interconnected. We see democracy as being at the heart of all of our work. All of the Foundation's research is done collaboratively. We don't do studies on others, we do studies with them. We are learning from what they are learning, and Kettering tries to go about its work in a way that is compatible with the kind of democracy we study, a democracy that depends on shared learning to make long-lasting constructive change. These other parties include a broad array of organizations that work directly with the people in communities. These include religious congregations, civic organizations, grant makers, governments, schools and college, the media, and libraries. We don't make grants, so Kettering doesn't fund what these other organizations do. Instead, we learn from their experiences, and in return, we share what we are learning from previous research. Research done with other organizations and institutions in the US may imply a partnership, as in the joint ownership of a single business. But few of these other groups, however, are institutes like Kettering. The other groups are more like allies or fellow travelers and partners. So in the chart here, I'm illustrating the broad array of organizations that we interact with. As you'll notice, Kettering is not at the center of the network. We are just one of many organizations with interconnected interests. And NIFI, which is the shorthand for the National Issues Forums Institute, is one of the organizations mentioned here, sort of in orange in the upper corner. Much of our research focuses on learning more about what happens when people deliberate together on the problems that they face. I thought it might be helpful to take a moment to talk about what deliberative democracy is, as that isn't a term that people use every day. Deliberative democracy centers around how we make decisions together in all sorts of ways. Betty will likely talk about the public deliberation that occurs in forums, but I think that stepping back for a moment and thinking about deliberation in everyday life can be useful. People make decisions all the time, and deliberative moments are mixed into ordinary conversations. Deliberative decision-making is necessary in collective action because people have to come to terms with disagreement and with conflict. In ordinary conversations, people talk about the problems that concern them, what action should be taken to respond, and who is needed to act. Deliberation can involve listening as much as it does speaking. By listening attentively, we can take in the experiences of others without necessarily agreeing with what they're advocating for. In fact, as I talk through this, it reminds me a lot of the anecdote that Nita shared with us just a few moments ago. In deliberation at its best, people recognize the tensions among the things they hold dear, and that encourages the careful weighing of various alternatives for action. Without deliberation, discussions can break down. So when I think about understanding deliberative democracy practically, I think one way to do this is to think of the tug and pull we can experience as we make decisions as individuals. So tomorrow is Friday and on the verge of a weekend, and I bet many of us experience conflicting desires for how to spend our Friday evening. Here's an example of what this could look like for me. Because this is a busy time at the Kettering Foundation, I can imagine that I could be asked to work late in order to keep projects moving forward. I'm also a mother, and so my daughter might want to have a friend over and fun dinner plans. My husband, however, might be made happier if we were able to go on a date on our own. And on lots of Fridays, I might also get a call from my mom asking my family to spend some time with her and my dad. So in this hypothetical example, I could be faced with weighing the pros and cons of various decisions I could make based not just on my own wants and needs, but also of my employer, my daughter, my husband, and my parents. Deliberation can really be messy and difficult. So in this slide, I've included what we at Kettering call democratic practices. These are the things that people do every day in their communities to address the problems that they face. This includes deliberating together, but it also includes all of the work that we must do surrounding that deliberation. At Kettering, we've learned that there are opportunities and everyday routines to turn them into the democratic practices used by citizens to generate the power to make a useful difference. So these 6 democratic practices include naming the issues facing people in their own terms, in terms of what is most valuable to them, framing issues so that a range of actions are considered fairly and the trade-offs are evident, making decisions deliberatively, which means weighing the trade-offs to turn hasty reactions into sound judgments, identifying community resources that are available, including the intangible ones like enthusiasm and commitment, organizing the actions of citizens in a complementary way, and finally, encouraging constant collective learning to keep the work going. I want to conclude my remarks this evening by talking for a moment about a challenge that institutions face: distrust. Recent events have revealed the fragility of our institutions and the norms supporting them. We see this as a problem of democracy. It makes it difficult for us to work together as citizens when there is heightened polarization and divisiveness, as well as growing mistrust of institutions. Now, distrust in institutions is not a new problem. Failing confidence in governing institutions goes all the way back to the 1970s. And as a member of Generation X, I've often pointed out that for those roughly my age and younger, most institutions have never benefited from a high level of trust. This distrust began in our childhoods and has only increased with time. These institutions include many of the ones that we would readily think of when we think of our communities and day-to-day lives: print and television news, the government, both at the federal and local levels, big businesses, and the public schools. When I was preparing to meet with you today, I looked at recent Gallup polling, as well as the work of the Pew Research Center again, and unfortunately, institutions just continue to struggle to be seen as trusted. There were small upticks for certain institutions, including public education and healthcare throughout the pandemic, but those have been small upturns and are fairly unlikely to last. Now, there are some institutions that benefit from higher levels of trust, And one that came to mind for me is public libraries. Unlike many of these other institutions, libraries continue to benefit from a high level of trust from the public. And why is this? Well, one reason may be that they help to provide information, are open to all in communities, and they do not take a partisan position in terms of the work that they do. They are also often used as meeting spaces for other community groups and organizations. Many libraries over the past several years have become more involved with civic engagement efforts in their communities, and they are often looking for other organizations to partner with. They may be a potential ally in communities for leagues to explore. So I think I'll stop there, as I know that this is a lot to take in, and I want to thank you for your attention, and I'm going to turn back to Janice.
There you go. I had muted myself, but I'm back. Thank you so much. So now it's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Betty Knighton. Betty is president of the National Issues Forum Institute, and she'll tell you more about that. I know Betty has a keen interest in exploring practices that support public deliberation in communities and the emergence of learning centers for civic life, and effective practices for incorporating initiatives that foster deliberative discussions of public issues in the life of the community. So Betty, thanks for being with us tonight, and take it away.
Thank you so much, Janice. And I've just really been looking forward to this opportunity to be with you all this evening, and to the topic for tonight, civic learning and civil discourse, is at the core of so many of the practices that are based on the research that Melinda has described, and what I'll describe to you this evening as the practices that are involved in national issues forums all around the country. So first of all, I want to say thanks to Janice and to Eileen and to the planning committee for inviting us to be a part of this discussion this evening. And I'm really interested to hear your thoughts and ideas as the evening moves on. What I want to focus on are the practices that people are using all around the country to put some of those research insights that Melinda shared into practical use in their communities, as they talk about a whole range of issues that affect the quality of life in the places where they live. And so what we would like to do this evening is to make sure you're aware of some of the resources that are available to help people who are trying to do that kind of work, and to welcome your participation in any way that is useful to you and to your goals stated in the title of this evening's presentation, which is Empowering Citizens and Strengthening Democracy. So that's what we want to focus on this evening, by tying together the research of Kettering with the practices that are involved in national issues forums around the country. It's based on the idea that in a democracy, people have a right, and many would say a responsibility, to talk and work together productively on the issues that impact our lives as citizens of this country. And so I'm so appreciative of Melinda for giving that example of a practical example of deliberation. I'm going to be intrigued to find out how she decides to spend her Friday evening. You'll have to let me know. Probably a combination of several things. If I know you, she's a master juggler. But when I talk to people who are new to these kinds of concepts, and I know many of you are quite familiar with them already, I usually talk about a deliberation in the very terms that Melinda described, which is that in our own lives, we deliberate naturally on a whole range of issues. We've all made decisions about our education and what jobs to take and where to live and how to use our resources to meet the needs of our family. And when we are talking about those issues, we're talking about not just how they affect us, but how they affect others. So if you think of the last time you had to be deliberative in your own life, it might have been this morning or last night or last week. But if you think about the last time that you had an opportunity to be in a really deliberative discussion with other people who have different experiences than you, who are from different walks of life than you, maybe people that you've never met before, but that have a common interest in a public issue because it impacts their lives as it impacts yours. I don't think it would be necessarily last night or last week or maybe last month. For some people, it might be last year, and for some people, it might be hardly ever. And so what we're really focusing on is that the kind of issues that impact our lives, we need more intentional opportunities for people to come together in communities or on campuses or in classrooms and have these kinds of discussions about the issues that are so important to us in this country and that are all too rare in the ways that we currently talk about public issues. There are certainly people all over the country that are doing this kind of work, including many that we know in Texas and through here in my home state of West Virginia, and in pretty much every state in the United States are involved in this kind of work. So let me describe national issues forums to you, and I'll start by acknowledging that the word forum can mean a lot of different things to different people. And so I know from, I've had the pleasure of working with the League of Women Voters here in my home state, and I know that here and across the country, you talk about candidate forums, and there's a particular structure for a candidate forum. And so we're using the term specifically to mean deliberative discussions, public discussions about public issues that are looking at multiple perspectives. So you can just think of it as a deliberative discussion when we use the word forum, and probably is different in different places in terms of what your purpose is with the way that you're using that word. So mainly national issues forums, when I think of that, I think mainly of people, because all of this happens because there are people all over this country who believe that it's their responsibility to be intentional about providing opportunities for people to come together and have these kinds of discussions. Sometimes they are from public libraries. Sometimes they are from faith groups. Sometimes they are from government agencies or education, from the private sector. Sometimes they're from leagues of women voters, civic organizations, nonprofits, pretty much any sector, including volunteer groups around the country, can be conveners of these discussions. Ideally, there's partnerships among and between many different types of organizations in order to bring people together in their communities. But the heart of it, no matter who is convening, no matter who is organizing and inviting, the heart of it is public deliberation about the issues that impact our lives. My very first experience with working with the League of Women Voters was here in West Virginia in 1992. We were fortunate that the national president of the League of Women Voters is our local West Virginia dear friend, who's become a dear friend and colleague. Some of you may have known Betty Knighton separately, who was the league president if you've been around a long time. And she and I worked together on an initiative around the presidential election in 1992, helping people talk about the issues that were really at the top of people's minds in that election. So I've just seen the impact that the league has had in encouraging people to become more informed voters, not just informed of their own views, but informed about the views of others so that they can make decisions when they exercise their right to vote. So what happens in a deliberative discussion? Well, first of all, you have a chance to explore your own views. And you might think, well, that's obvious, you know your own views. But honestly, I think once we start talking to other people, we begin to get a deeper insight into what we actually think. And we become deliberative in our own minds. In other words, you may see conflicting perspectives even in your own way of thinking about an issue that you need to work through. You certainly learn about what other people think and why good people with good motives might have different points of view and try to understand what those are. You examine a range of trade-offs and consequences that could come from moving in any particular direction. The goal is not to reach a consensus. And so that you say, well, at the end of this, we all have decided we're going to do this one particular thing. It's not to choose one particular action over another, but it is to listen for emerging directions or next steps that might be taken, despite the existence of continued differences of opinion in many of the areas that you've discussed. So you acknowledge the disagreements and the agreements and the challenges, and you work towards some shared directions that could be taken in your community or as a nation based on the discussions that you've had. Now, as Nita's example really vividly pointed out for us at the outset, these kinds of conversations can be challenging. They can be difficult to have, and yet I've seen them work so effectively time and time again when people come together using a framework that shows multiple perspectives with a moderator or a facilitator that tries to elicit those different perspectives from people who are in the room. But some of the challenges you can imagine, because I'm sure you're in this world all of the time, is that the perception is that we are in disagreement about everything, that there's this side and there's that side, that one's right and one's wrong. And of course, yours is the right one and theirs is the wrong one. That's how we're sort of being shown the kind of the perspective that seems to be, a predominant one, at least in terms of perception, if not in terms of actual fact. And so people sometimes might be reluctant to even try to become part of one of these deliberative discussions. They might assume they're going to have to just go in and just argue their point, that they're going to have to fight to be heard, that they might have a minority viewpoint, and so that might get pushed aside, that one side might be pitted against the other. And if that's your perception of what a public discussion has been, maybe it's been your experience in the past, you can understand why people might be reluctant. And so in order to address those concerns, there's a great deal of research that goes into creating frameworks that people use for these public discussions. And the research of the Kettering Foundation and their writing and development of discussion materials is invaluable to the ability of national issues forums practitioners to be able to have these kinds of discussions around the country. So the structure itself is multi-perspective. The moderator or facilitator encourages people to examine a wide range of different points of view, using guidelines for the discussion that are agreed upon by the group that include things like listening as well as speaking, to really interrogate your own point of view, to look at the downsides or the trade-offs, even of the options that you favor, so that you're being a critical thinker about which way to go forward. And this I find most important is that one of the things that I think helps people be less challenged to have these conversations is realizing that different points of view are not just welcomed, they're not just tolerated, they're necessary. We know that we have different points of view in this country on different issues. And so being able to work through those different points of view is a critical part of being able to make strong public decisions. And so over the last 40 years almost now, National Issues Forums has been developing materials and practices and developing a network of practitioners around the country who do this kind of work in their own communities on issues such as education, a whole range of issues on education. We've just recently created an initiative related to, it's called School Interrupted, and it has to do with how to continue educating our children in this country during a pandemic. On economic well-being, on health, and a range of issues related to health, including mental health, addiction, issues related to access to healthcare and affordability. A lot of national issues forums have dealt with issues related to governance, how we govern ourselves. And most recently, we're really focusing on the issue of voting in America. And so in order to show you an example of national issues forums and how these kinds of deliberative discussions might work in your own places, I'll use the issue of voting. I also know that voting is an issue on which the League of Women Voters has been a national leader since its inception. And so we thought this issue might be of interest to you as well. So I'm going to switch up here for just a second and share my screen and show you some materials that we want to make sure you're aware of. And also, this is an example of how lots of other issues can be discussed in communities as well. So this national initiative we just launched 3 weeks ago in June, and it'll be going on as long as people want to continue talking about this in their own communities. It's called How Can We Encourage and Safeguard Voting? And it's a multi-perspective framework used in public discussion online or in person when we are able to do that. And some places are able to do that now, but many people are still having these discussions online. So when I say multi-perspective, in a national issues forum on this issue, some of the time would be spent looking at an approach that says what we really need to do is make it easier to register and easier to vote. We need to remove barriers and make voting more accessible to people. There's another school of thought, and this isn't necessarily mutually exclusive, but another approach says we really have to be take of utmost concern to make our elections secure. And so you can imagine that some of the things that might be favored for making elections secure might tend, in some people's views, to make them less accessible. Or so there would be some trade-offs and consequences in terms of how people talk about those approaches. And then another approach would be, we really need to have better options for people so that they don't feel not just barriers to the voting process, but to how their vote matters. And so that would involve looking at things like how districts are gerrymandered, for example, so that people feel that if they're not the party in the majority in their district, that their vote isn't going to really matter or make a difference. Looking at various issues related to how candidates become candidates and how people have opportunities to learn more about them. So this is the typical flow of a deliberative forum or a deliberative discussion. And sometimes people have this discussion in one sitting. In other cases, people might have a series of discussions in order to really go in depth on an issue such as voting. But the opening would be an overview of the issue. You would review some of the guidelines that I mentioned in terms of participation of people in the forum. There are conversation starter videos that help people get kind of acclimated to the broad scope of concerns that people have about this. It's really important in a deliberative discussion for people to have an opportunity to connect personally to the issue. So they're not seeing it only as a policy option or as something that happens over there, but they're seeing it as something that affects their own lives. And so we call that a personal stake in the issue. And then it's really important for people to consider each of the approaches in terms of what's attractive, what's drawbacks, what are the trade-offs that are involved, really looking at consequences, some which may be unintended, in moving in a particular direction. And then the final part of a deliberative discussion or discussion series is to reflect on what were the areas of common concern, what were the areas of greatest disagreement, what were the trade-offs that we would have to make in order to move forward. Who else do we need to hear from in order to move forward on this issue? And so these are some of the sample guidelines that I mentioned earlier. I won't read all those to you, but these are typically the kind of guidelines that are shared with participants in forums. And in these discussions, the moderator or the facilitator behaves neutrally. Rather than saying they are neutral, I usually say behave neutrally, because none of us are really neutral on all these issues. We have our own points of view, but for the civic service that you're providing to your community when you do this kind of work, then you are behaving neutrally. But of course, you're encouraging other people to share their views. There's a range of background material that has some information in the discussion guides. I just pulled this one up because a lot of people really like to see how the US is doing as opposed to other countries in the country when it comes in the world, when it comes to looking at the percentage of the voting age population. So this is the kind of material you would see in the discussion guide among many other types of information. Some people want to know how their state stacks up against other states. This particular graphic shows you, and I'm sure your eyes went immediately to Texas, right? Every time I see one of these, I look right at West Virginia. And Texas and West Virginia are pretty easy to pick out with their panhandles. They're interesting shapes, I should say. So Texas does not have automatic voter registration, and West Virginia does, for example. This gets into voter identification by state, and again, you see that there are differences in different parts of the country. But people often find it really interesting to know what our state is doing, what other states are doing, why they are, and maybe look into that a little bit more closely. And so some of what National Issues Forums guides provide is background information about the issue at hand. And then I mentioned the heart of it is looking at these different approaches. And so we won't look at all of these particulars, but just to give you an idea, under the first approach I mentioned about making it easier to register and to vote, you would consider a range of different actions, but you'd also look at the possible drawbacks that are involved in those actions. It may be that you still really favor the action, but just kind of being informed about what might be the downside, what might be the trade-off. Are you willing to make that, or others, if you go in that particular direction? And that would be the case for the first approach, the one that I mentioned about making elections secure, these are not the only actions that you could take by far, but there are 4 key ones that showed up in Kettering's research whenever they were looking at this issue that became part of the National Issues Forum Guide. And then this is the third approach about just making sure that people have more and better choices when they vote and all the things that go into that. What else could you do would be a part of this discussion as well. And then, as I mentioned, the final part of a deliberative forum is really reflecting on the discussion. What are the areas of greatest agreement and disagreement? One of the questions that we added in some national forums that took place with people from all over the country in June, we had people from many different states in the same forum together, which obviously we could do because it was online. If a reporter were describing today's discussion to the public, how would you want it described? And we put that in there to help people think reflectively and broadly about what the key points and the key takeaways for them were whenever they were leaving that discussion. There are lots of supportive materials that are available. All of these things are complimentary and you're most welcome to use them, and they can all be downloaded from the National Issues Forum's website. There's the discussion guide itself. There's a guide for the moderator or the facilitator with tips for moderating this forum. There's that discussion starter video I mentioned. There are issue-based slides. I showed you a few of them that you could share or you could localize. Many people would take that information and do similar information about the state of Texas or the state of West Virginia in order to localize the material. And then there's a questionnaire that you can use to gather insights from the participants. I also wanted to make sure that you're aware of different ways in which these can be handled online. When we're back and have more opportunities to be in person on a regular basis, and many of us already are doing that, there's always, I think, still a place for online deliberation because you can bridge geographical boundaries. People from different parts of the state can be together in one space at the same time, or for that matter, even different parts. I live in a pretty large county, and having people together from different parts of my county online would be a very convenient and welcoming way and inclusive way to invite people in. You bring people together who normally wouldn't be able to talk. You can increase the diversity of viewpoints, and then you could have large and small group interactions through breakout rooms. And so Zoom is one of the face-to-face versions that we have. We also have a platform called Common Ground for Action, which is more of a text-based platform for people where people can be deliberative. I just threw this in because I think it's fun and I wanted you to see it. These are 37 different community colleges and universities in the state of New York, and they were all together in one place at one time talking about voting. There were students from 37 colleges and universities, and there were almost 200 students. And of course, we use the breakout feature. You can imagine we would definitely need the breakout feature for that. I just want to make sure you have this. We're going to send you some follow-up information, and you'll get this again. But if you want more information about any of those materials or those practices, you can go to the website nifi.org, or you can email info@nif.org, and we'll be really happy to talk to you more about that. So I'll stop now and go back to Janice, and you can let us know how we're going to interact from here on out. But thank you so much for the time to talk to you this evening and to share some of the practices that are happening all over this country with you.
Well, thank you so much, Betty. So let me tell you what we're going to do now. We have about 10-15 minutes so we can just stay together if we can talk about questions or go deeper into any area that Betty or Melinda mentioned. And then after that, we are going to use the breakout feature and break out into some small groups so we can talk with each other about sort of ideas that are sparked during this conversation about what we can use for our own leagues. So if you have a question and you haven't entered it in the chat and you want to do so, or just something that you want to hear more about, go ahead and do that. But I'm going to start off with one because I have one. When we started working on this topic, we were talking about initially, the first part of it, civic learning. And actually we did a survey of our leagues on topics, and some of the responses on civic learning kind of suggested that, we were thinking about, this is what happens in school. This is like formal teaching. This is what happens in school. But then other comments said, well, there are a lot that we all need to learn about how our government works, just government works for one thing, how our communities work. And so that's how we kind of got from civic learning as a classroom to civic learning as what we do in civil discourse. And so, Betty, you were talking about forums as intentional ways of creating productive conversations. And Melinda, you were talking about Kettering's work about the important role of citizens. So what can you share about, how we can really advance civic learning? Like what does it take for us to, as leagues, how can we really help that happen outside of doing a formal class? Did I stump you?
No, it didn't. I'm just wondering if Betty wants to go first or if she wants me to go first.
But I was just looking at Melinda and trying to see if she was going to go first. What I love about the notion of civic learning is that a lot of times people think about what you learn as you learn about an issue, and that is a part of learning as a part of a civic atmosphere. But what and I think the league has been a leader in terms of providing opportunities for people to learn about issues and to be informed voters. What I see that really sticks with me in terms of civic learning is communities is when they have an opportunity to develop their capacity to be able to be like active citizens in a community, and then to learn about the impact that work has on the life of the community, on their own lives, and to develop practices based on those experiences. And so they're really learning about the way their community can function, especially with the contribution of them as active parts of that community. One of the places I worked with recently said that they had explored this issue in a deliberative way. They had explored this issue in a different way. And she said, and then we just decided this is the way we're going to be from now on. I think that's civic learning. They tried things that they found to be productive and useful. And so they built on those practices to learn new ways to address problems.
It makes me think about developing a civic muscle, right? So if you're someone who likes to exercise, I like to run. I'm not going to get to be a better runner if I don't run regularly, right? So I need to get outdoors, do that practice, make sure I stretch, have the time, drink water, eat healthy, like all of the things that sort of add up to the capacity to develop a muscle to be able to run. And I think about communities in the same way, that we really can't address problems unless we're able to work together and have that civic muscle. And it doesn't happen overnight, it happens over time. When Nita was talking about how, I forget how many years she said, but it seems as if this group of Muslim and Christian women have been gathering for many years to talk and have meals together. Well, to me, that's developing a civic muscle, right? So now they're facing some conversations that are very, very hard. That earlier, maybe it was a little bit more social and a little bit more fun. And so at this moment, it's trickier. But I think that they may be better poised to be able to do that work together because they've already had that ongoing dialogue and time. And it just doesn't happen overnight.
That's right. I mean, we've met for 6 years and once a month. And this is the first time we've been talking about various opinions on faith, but we've never had something come up like this until this particular situation. It was easier to respect very different faith viewpoints than it was this situation.
So, Elaine, have you spotted some a question that you want to help us? I'm looking here through chat in case I missed something. There was one comment I think I'll direct to Betty. So someone mentioned that they disagreed with the option of like doing more to make elections more secure, and since there was their perception is no problem with election security. So like talk more about why that option was included in the forum guide.
Whenever these issues are researched, there's broad public outreach to understand how different people in this country view the issue and what different people think. And so I'm sure that we are very aware that people are quite concerned about election security. And other people are really saying that is really not the issue. The issue is access to voting. And other people are saying we need better choices to begin with. So there are lots of different ways to look at the issue. And so invariably, I would say invariably in any like multi-perspective framework that we've developed for use, you personally will find things you agree with, things that you disagree with, things that you want to learn more about and you're not so sure about, things that you think are inconsequential, things that you think are the heart. But that is because people in this country have those different points of view as well. And so the idea is not to change your mind or to make you, well, I think this way, but to understand different points of view. It's really interesting how when people come together thinking their points of view are really different, when they dig down, there is something underneath there that they could agree to work on, or they could agree on, even while they still hold their different points of view very dearly. So that's what I mean about behaving neutrally. If you would be leading a discussion, whether it's on voting or healthcare or whatever it's on, you would be putting aside your point of view just for the civic service that you're doing for the group of people that shows up to be a part of the discussion.
Yeah, so this is making me think about, I introduced myself as Service to Local Leagues Committee, but I'm also with the League of Women Voters of Lavaca County where I live. And think of, since our league has a position on voting, we wouldn't hold a forum on voting, but just using this process, we did kind of work on something in the league world. If we had done something a little like bigger on this, we would have called it a study. That's the league word we would use for really digging into an issue. But we worked on broadband. This is before the pandemic, and it's because we realized in our rural areas, so many of us had broadband problems. And so I'm just thinking about if we had thought about, or really had the courage actually, to bring people together, on broadband, even though we think like what could be the problem with a discussion about broadband, certainly everyone wants it. But I heard one difference, for example, that someone says, well, I don't want more broadband providers because my husband works for our main one and that might put him out of a job. Well, I know that never occurred to me. And so I just think, this process might hold some real promise just for those questions that come up that, are questions that would relate to quality of life in your community that you want to address as a league, but not go through a full study.
There are so many issues, both nationally and at the local level, that would benefit from a deliberative approach, I feel, because if you live in one community and there's going to be a kind of a way forward, if it's a decision about broadband or many other things, really thinking through the options that for those kinds of actions and understanding different points of view does allow usually some shared direction to be able to surface. It also allows people to kind of internalize their own points of view. A very powerful discussion I was in once in Southern West Virginia, a woman said, I was born in these mountains. I was raised in these mountains. I love these mountains. And every time I see a mountaintop removed in order to get the coal out, it breaks my heart. But I know if we didn't have that, my son and my grandchildren would have to leave the state to find a job somewhere else. So she herself was just dealing with the internal tugs and pulls of what that meant, even just to her own family. And so then being able to bring those perspectives into a community discussion just enriches it for everybody and allows people to understand what's at stake for the people that are affected by these issues.
Well, I see a couple more questions pop up. So one is like how to deal with those people who are let's call them hecklers, who just seem to get great joy out of coming and disrupting a meeting. So do you have any tips for that? And I'll add another question to that because I think this is related, is that does National Issues Forum train moderators? So do you have any tips for the moderators?
I've been so fortunate not to deal with hecklers. And I think a lot of times people who are trying to be disruptive are doing something that's like framed in more political terms, and they want to heckle the other party, or they want to heckle the other perspective. And usually when people understand what the nature of this kind of a discussion is it's really to hear different points of view. So you don't really have to heckle in order to be heard. That's not to say that people who don't buy into that approach aren't going to possibly be disruptive. Obviously, if you're online, there's the mute button. But when you're in person, it's a different matter. And so generally speaking, I think once you do that tone setting at the beginning, it minimizes the option that the likelihood that will happen. On very rare occasions, I've heard of people having to take a mic away if there's a mic, or just be very direct and ask somebody to leave if that happens. But I've just never really experienced that, and I've been in hundreds of these discussions at this point. As far as providing guidance to moderators, in a variety of ways this happens. We provide a lot of support materials, like moderator materials. We have videos on our website, tips for moderators there. Occasionally we do webinars for just national webinars where people can sign up and just learn more about moderating practices. And then there are people in many parts of each of the country, including some in Texas, that do this locally. And so I'm not calling out any particular place right now, but I know that there are folks in the Houston area and in the Austin area and in El Paso and other places that I'm sure I'm leaving out that are very involved in this kind of work, and periodically do offer local in-person workshops for people. And I don't know of any that are scheduled right at this moment. I just know that there are real hubs of activity in at least those 3 parts of Texas, and more that I'm not just thinking of right now. And so there's that possibility too. So we could connect nationally online through a webinar, but we could also kind of put you in touch with people in your state who do this kind of work. And that would be a real pleasure.
That's fantastic. So here's another question about how to engage families living in a gated apartment complex while keeping the meetings within the complex and keeping in mind that they have very little free time. So you've got kind of a more limited group, and time is a problem. Any thoughts?
One thing I would say is that serving food matters. A lot of times bringing people together around snacks or a meal is a draw. And I would also think in a community like that, childcare might help. So if there's something that the children could be doing while the adults are participating in a deliberative conversation, I think that would be an asset to them. Betty, you're going to have a lot of ideas about this, but I also sometimes think of forums that are done in brief can sometimes work really well for people who are time compressed. So a lot of times a forum might be as long as this webinar. It might be 90 minutes or even as long as 2 hours, but you can move through each of the options pretty quickly and say like a 60-minute time frame. And I think it still can be really valuable. And I know that forums I've participated in, often the official forum has ended and people still keep chatting afterwards. They don't want to stop the conversation. So it might be a way to get people in that community interacting in a way that they haven't previously. Betty, though, you have been in hundreds of forums, so you're going to have even more ideas than I do.
Well, I think that's certainly a very strong one. Another one might be if you could divide it up into smaller chunks of time, because sometimes people have 45 minutes 3 times, but they don't have an hour and 45 minutes one time because they have to get the kids to bed and they have to get the lunches ready for the next day and all the other things that are going on in our lives. And so one thing I just absolutely loved is a group here in my hometown had a brown bag lunch series where people just pack their own lunch and they provided, the lemonade or whatever for lunch, the beverage, and people just came in, and really they just had about 30 minutes each time, but they came back together more than once. And so that really worked in a variety of ways. One, it fit their time frame of the amount of time they could spare, but it also allowed new people to join the conversation, and it allowed them to kind of think and learn more in between each session. So that's another possibility.
Very good. Well, we need to wrap this part of our evening up, and so we can have time to get in our breakouts. And so thank you, Betty and Melinda. And actually, we're going to send you to breakouts too. So you show up, and you'll show up somewhere, and you can continue this chat with the group with you. So now what we're going to do is we're going to head to breakout rooms. We're just going to do this for 10 minutes. And we're going to use, let Zoom do the work of breaking us out tonight. So they're going to be randomly assigning us to groups of 6. So once Sophie pushes the magic button, we're just going to all head to our rooms without having to decide where we're going to go. So this is our chance to meet some new league colleagues and talk about what we're learning tonight, how we might use it. So 2 things I'll ask you to do in our 10 minutes. First of all, be sure and introduce yourself, say where you're from so you know who you're with. And second of all, you can talk about what from tonight do you think you might want to take back to your league, and at least chew on or think more about sort of what implications might this conversation have for your league. I know many of you have done studies. Some of you are like virtuosos in candidate forums. They've done a lot of moderating that way. But I think the question here is more about how to be more deliberative, more intentional about creating opportunities for people to deliberate even outside of the standard study or candidate forum process. And so if you'll do that, and when we come back, if we have time, we'd like to hear from just a couple of you about, something that you talked about. Time might not permit, so we'll see. But if you might listen for that and ask someone to be your spokesperson if you want to share. So at that, Sophie, can you break us out? And we will get a warning from Sophie when we're about to come back. So you'll see when your time's about up. So I hope everyone had the same experience that we were just, I'm sorry that we didn't have a little bit more time, but I just wonder if there's somebody that wants to share a highlight of their discussion. We have a room for just a few of these. So Pat, come on and share.
We had a wonderful discussion, and Melinda was in our group, so that was terrific. And it was interesting. We had a librarian, Roxana, from Comal area, League of Women Voters, and but with lots of ideas about partnering with the libraries, and even bringing books, even related to the apartment complex idea, having a library bring books to apartment complexes. And some of our libraries may do that. And then a couple of our people in our group also mentioned that they have been participating with other organizations, one being Braver Angels, and another one called Let's Talk, both of which are organizations, nonpartisan, that bring people together. And Melinda mentioned that those are organizations that the Kettering Foundation has also partnered with. So it was a great conversation.
Fantastic. So I see Anna Schiefer's hand up. So you want to go?
I'm sorry, did you say Janice?
Yeah, I saw you.
Yeah. In our group, we had a high school government teacher, and she was already downloading some materials from the nifi.org site. And we thought that possibly some of the moderator materials would be helpful for our own league candidate forums and other forums. And we also thought that civic education would be a very important topic to maybe partner with other organizations and have some forums on, basically trying to learn how government works, why it's important, and make sure everybody understands the importance of the different parts of government. So those are just some ideas we talked about.
Fantastic. Is there somebody else who wants to share? See any hands up? Well, I will say
Janice Stoles.
Janice. We have another Janice. Okay, go ahead.
We had a great discussion. We had an intern, Andy, who has just joined League today. And so it was really exciting to have a young person that's interested in doing things. So we were very excited about that. We talked a lot about listening to the other side, that it's so important. Our discourse right now seems to be talk to the people we agree with. And so that it's so important to listen to all sides of an issue. And we also loved how they talked about, both speakers talked about deliberative discussion. And when they talked about the parts of the discussion, nowhere in the discussion did it say, figure out which side is right. That, you know, what we're basically doing is trying to come to a truth, and that it's so important to listen to everyone and all sides of an issue.
Any other hands up? So Meg, you're good helping me spot them.
Are you ready for my announcement?
Yeah, I just wanted to share. I have to share something from our group because we were talking about wanting to talk with, knowing it's important to hear other perspectives also, but also how important it is to identify sort of natural allies. And even with natural allies, we may not agree on approaches or positions or whatever. And that, so just kind of the depth of use of the deliberative process, that kind of building relationships with natural allies. So I just wanted to share that. I thought it was an interesting perspective. So before I turn this over, Meg is going to do our farewells tonight and tell us about what's coming up in August. But I just want to thank you all for being here, and thank Eileen and Sophie for helping make this happen, the technology work and everything, and especially thank Melinda and Betty for agreeing to be here and share your insights, research, and experience with us. We are going to be sending out an email after this that will have a feedback form, so please give us your feedback. We intend to be sharing a resource list as well too, so look for that in your email. Next week sometime, I'm not going to promise Monday, but just look for it sooner rather than later. So with that, Meg, take us away.
Absolutely. Thank you all, and look forward to Thursday, August 12th at 7 p.m. because our next one will be expanding and going forward to being League in this political climate. So we will hear from League of Women Voter Texas President Grace Shameen, Elizabeth McNamara, who's the immediate past president of League of Women Voters US, and Tony Zimmer, who is the current LWV US chair of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee, and she's also on the LWV US boards, and they are going to share their thoughts, their concerns, their advice, and their invitations about being League in this political climate. We look forward to you and your League colleagues there and then. Thank you.